He just wanted to care for his sick wife. Night after night, he sat beside her bed in silence, watching her fade away with dementia, until he began to suspect something wasn't right. So he decided to install a hidden camera in her room. But what he saw there completely changed everything he thought he knew about his wife, about their past, and even about himself. From that moment on, old secrets began to surface. Voices in the early hours, unexpected visitors, a forbidden name, and the reappearance of someone he believed had never existed. Prepare yourself for a story that's realistic, devastating, and impossible to predict. By the end, you'll be asking yourself, what if this happened in my family? But before we continue, you need to see what that camera revealed. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss stories like this one, and tell us in the comments. Which city are you watching from? When Rakura Menzies woke for the 5th time that morning, his wife's breathing sounded different. It wasn't the fragile wheeze of someone in advanced stages of dementia as the medical report indicated. It was rhythmic, alive, as if waiting for something. Rakura sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes red from nights of poor sleep, watching the rain streak down the windows of their modest weatherboard home in Lower Hutt. The Wellington Harbor winds rattled the old window frames like skeletal fingers against glass, but inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the steady hum of the oxygen concentrator they'd hired from the medical supply company in Petone. He hesitated before touching the remote control of the small hidden camera he had discreetly installed behind one of the Maori sculptures in his wife's room. The carved jade tiki had belonged to Kahurangi's grandmother, passed down through generations of strong Maori women who had survived colonization, land wars, and the slow erosion of their culture. Te Waia, Kahurangi used to call it. The mother. Now it served as camouflage for his desperate attempt to understand what was happening to the woman he'd loved for 37 years, the woman who'd stood beside him through redundancy, depression, and the devastating loss of their first child. Since the diagnosis, he felt something didn't make sense. The doctors at Wellington Hospital had been thorough, their reports detailed and filled with medical terminology that made his head spin. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the neurologist with kind eyes and gentle hands, had shown him brain scans that looked like gray storms on black seas. Significant hippocampal damage, she'd explained, pointing to shadows that apparently represented the destruction of his wife's memories. The oxygen deprivation during the fire caused extensive neurological impairment. I'm sorry, Mr. Menzies, but the woman you knew, she's not coming back. But something in his gut twisted every time they spoke about irreversible brain damage. Kahurangi had moments, fleeting seconds when her eyes seemed to focus with laser intensity, when she'd reach for his hand with purpose rather than the random grasping the physiotherapist said was normal. Moments when she'd hum old Maori Waiata under her breath, songs she claimed not to remember when the occupational therapist tested her recall, and what he saw that early morning made his blood freeze. The image was grainy, but clear enough to see every detail of the room he knew so well. There was the woman he loved, Kahurangi Menzies, lying in the hospital bed they'd hired when the stairs became too difficult for her weakened legs. Her silver-streaked hair spread across the pillow like spilled moonlight, the same hair he used to braid when they were young and she'd fall asleep reading novels by Patricia Grace and Witi Ihimaera. The room smelled of antiseptic cream and the lavender essential oils he'd been dabbing on her wrists, hoping to trigger some memory, some spark of recognition that would bring her back to him. The walls were covered with photographs from their life together. Their wedding day at the Otaki Maori church, holidays in Rotorua where they'd honeymooned, pictures of the baby they'd lost and the children who never came after. He'd put them there on the advice of the memory care specialist, creating a visual timeline that might penetrate whatever fog had settled over his wife's mind. But then, with an almost ceremonial slowness that made his stomach clench with dread, she opened her eyes. Not the vacant, unfocused gaze he'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 years, but sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness with the clarity of someone fully present. She lifted her torso slightly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Nothing like the fumbling confusion that had characterized her waking hours for months, and murmured, in a firm voice, almost irritated, "He can't know. Not yet." Raukura's heart stopped. The voice that emerged from his wife's lips had no trace of confusion or cognitive limitation. It was the voice of the woman who used to debate politics with him over morning coffee, who could recite entire passages from Maori legends, who had once been the sharpest administrative assistant at the Hutt City Council before budget cuts forced her into early retirement. It was the voice of the woman who'd held him when his father died, who'd whispered comfort during his darkest moments after losing their baby. He turned up the volume on his laptop, his hands trembling so violently he nearly knocked over the cold cup of tea beside him, tea that had been sitting there since midnight when he'd given up trying to sleep and retreated to his makeshift surveillance station in the spare room. Kahurangi was looking directly at someone outside the camera's field of view. Her expression, one he recognized from their early marriage, the look she wore when making difficult decisions, when protecting something precious, when standing up to his mother who'd never thought a Maori girl was good enough for her son. "You promised to protect me, and protect her too." The words hit him like a physical blow. Who was her, and whom was she talking to? The house was locked, every window secured with the safety catches he'd installed after the fire, every door fitted with deadbolts that he checked obsessively each night before bed. No one should have access to that room without him knowing. They lived at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Naine where Mrs. Patterson from next door spent her days watching through lace curtains, where nothing happened without the entire street knowing about it within hours. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where people still looked out for each other, where Mr. Singh brought them vegetables from his garden, where young Emma from 3 doors down offered to help with shopping, where everyone had rallied around them after the fire with casseroles and offers of assistance that had sustained them through the worst months. As the video continued, a shadow passed across the wall, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the careful precision of someone trying not to make noise on the old wooden floorboards that creaked with every step. Rakura paused the recording, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that misted in the cold air of the unheated spare room. That silhouette, it was unmistakable. The way the figure held his shoulders, slightly forward from years of carrying heavy equipment. The distinctive gait he'd observed countless times across their back fence. A measured walk that spoke of someone accustomed to emergency situations, to moving quickly but deliberately through dangerous spaces. The neighbor, Wiremu Fahe. Firefighter, single, always helpful, and strangely always present since the fire in the guest room 2 years before. Wiremu had been the first responder that terrible night, the one who'd carried Kahurangi's unconscious body from the smoke-filled room while Rakura stood frozen in the doorway, paralyzed by the sight of flames consuming the space where his wife had been taking what she'd said would be a quick, relaxing bath. Since then, Wiremu had been checking on them regularly, bringing groceries when Rakura seemed overwhelmed by the complexities of caregiving, offering to sit with Kahurangi when the isolation became too much. He'd installed the wheelchair ramp without being asked, had fixed the leaking tap in the kitchen, had somehow known exactly what they needed before they'd had to ask for help. Rakura had been grateful for the support, had seen it as neighborly kindness in a world that often felt indifferent to suffering. But now, watching this large man move through his house in the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where every piece of furniture stood, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with Wellington's winter winds. But what the devil was he doing there inside, in the middle of the night with his supposedly ill wife? Before he could think about calling the police, before he could process the full magnitude of what he was witnessing, Rakura pressed play again. What he heard next made him drop the remote control on the floor, the plastic casing cracking against the wooden boards with a sound that seemed to echo through the sleeping house. Kahurangi's voice crystal clear saying, "She's still out there, but I can't see her." Not until he knows the whole truth. Rakura's hands began to shake uncontrollably. Who was this she his wife spoke of with such tenderness? The way she said it with a mother's protective fierceness made his chest tighten with a grief he couldn't name. It was the same tone she'd used when talking about the baby they'd lost all those years ago. The same careful, reverent way she'd whispered about the daughter they'd planned to name Hayata, Morning Light, before the miscarriage at 12 weeks had shattered their dreams of parenthood. And why did Wiremu seem so involved? In the dim light of the recording, he could see the firefighter's face clearly for the first time. There were tears in his eyes, and when he reached out to touch Kahurangi's hand, it was with the gentleness of someone who'd done it many times before, someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply, how to offer comfort without causing alarm. The weight of betrayal crushed Rakura's chest like a concrete slab. For 2 years he had been caring for a woman he thought had lost her mind, feeding her porridge with a spoon, speaking to her in the simplified sentences the occupational therapist had recommended for communicating with dementia patients. changing her nappies with the patient dignity the home care nurse had taught him, treating her body with the respect due to someone who could no longer maintain their own hygiene, speaking to her as if she were a child, sharing his daily thoughts because the doctors said familiar voices might penetrate the fog of dementia, might create moments of connection, even when recognition seemed impossible. He'd told her about the neighbor's new fence, about the price of petrol, about his worries for their financial future, now that her disability pension was their only steady income. And all this time, she had been perfectly lucid, plotting something he couldn't yet understand. But the most devastating part wasn't the deception itself. It was realizing that the woman he had loved for decades, the mother of the child they'd lost, the partner who'd stood beside him through his father's death and his own struggles with depression after being made redundant from the railway. This woman was a complete stranger, and apparently, she had been for much longer than he could imagine. 2 years earlier, a small candle lit in the bathroom had caused the fire that nearly took Kahurangi's life. At least, that was the story everyone told. The official narrative, repeated by doctors, firefighters, and Kahurangi herself in the confused, fragmented weeks following the incident, was that she'd been having a relaxing bath on that bitter Wellington winter evening in July, had lit a vanilla candle for ambiance, and somehow knocked it over when reaching for her towel. Raukura remembered that night with the crystalline clarity that trauma brings to memory. He'd been in the lounge watching the news, something about government budget cuts affecting public services, when he'd smelled smoke. Not the comfortable wood smoke from their neighbor's chimney, but the acrid chemical smell of synthetic materials burning. By the time he'd reached the bathroom door, it was too hot to touch, and he could hear Kahurangi calling his name through the thickening smoke. The flames had spread quickly through the old wooden bathroom, racing up the walls like hungry fingers, trapping her inside as smoke filled her lungs with toxins that would later, the doctors explained, deprive her brain of oxygen for crucial minutes. Wiremu Fehi had arrived before the fire trucks, appearing at their door in his volunteer firefighter gear as if summoned by some sixth sense. He'd kicked in the bathroom door when Raukura's attempts had failed, disappearing into the smoke-filled space with the kind of courage that made ordinary people seem heroic. The aftermath had been devastating. Oxygen deprivation, the emergency doctor at Wellington Hospital had explained in that careful, practiced tone they used for delivering life-altering news. Dr. James Morrison, a man whose gray beard and weary eyes spoke of too many difficult conversations, had sat them down in a sterile consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. "The brain is remarkably resilient," he'd said, spreading scan results across the table like tarot cards predicting a grim future. "But oxygen is life. When deprived for more than a few minutes, neurons begin to die. The damage your wife sustained, I'm afraid it's significant. Brain damage. Cognitive impairment." The woman who'd once managed complex filing systems at the council office, who remembered everyone's birthday and anniversary, who could recite genealogies going back 7 generations, was reduced to someone who couldn't recognize her own reflection in the mirror. Since then, she alternated between vacant stares and disconnected phrases. "The birds are singing backwards," she'd say during afternoon tea, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone she'd once used to discuss council budgets. Or, "Someone moved the blue cup," accompanied by frantic searching through cupboards for items that hadn't moved in years. Raukura had learned to nod and smile, to treat these utterances as the random firing of damaged neurons, the verbal equivalent of phantom limb pain. The occupational therapist, a kind woman named Helen Morrison, who drove out from Wellington twice a week, had taught him to create routines, to speak simply, to find comfort in small moments of connection, even when recognition seemed impossible. "Think of it like tending a garden after a harsh frost," she'd said, her weathered hands demonstrating how to guide Kahurangi through basic exercises. The roots might still be alive even when everything above ground appears dead. Helen had introduced them to support groups, to online forums for caregivers, to the strange new vocabulary of cognitive decline, sundowning, wandering, catastrophic reactions, words that became part of Raukura's daily reality as he learned to navigate this foreign landscape of lost memories and confused perceptions. But now, faced with the recent footage, everything seemed like a cruel performance. Raukura didn't know if he felt anger or relief. Relief perhaps to see her lucid again, to know that somewhere inside that seemingly broken shell, his wife still existed, still thought and felt and remembered their life together. Anger, certainly, for her hiding something so serious, for letting him believe he was losing her when she'd been there all along, watching him grieve for a ghost. The relief was intoxicating. For months he'd mourned the loss of his best friend, his confidant, the woman who'd understood his silences and shared his dreams. He'd grieved for conversations that would never happen again, for the shared glances that used to pass between them when their neighbors said something particularly ridiculous at community meetings. The thought that she might still be there, still capable of the connection he'd thought was lost forever, made him want to rush into her room and demand explanations. But the anger burned deeper. How could she watch him struggle with insurance companies who questioned every expense? How could she listen to him talking to her like a child, explaining simple concepts as if she'd never learned them? How could she let him change her nappies, feed her pureed food, make decisions about her care without any input from the person most affected? He spent the following days pretending normality, though every interaction felt like walking through quicksand. Beside the bed, changing her nappies with the mechanical efficiency he'd developed over months of practice, trying not to think about how humiliating this must be for a woman who'd always prized her independence, feeding her thin porridge mixed with the protein powder the dietitian had recommended, watching her accept each spoonful with the blank compliance he'd grown to expect, but now understood might be elaborate acting, chatting about the weather, about Mrs. Patterson's new cat that kept getting into their garden, about the roadworks on High Street that were making shopping trips more complicated, pretending to believe she didn't know who he was, while she pretended not to recognize the man she'd married in 1987 at the small wooden church in Otaki, where her grandmother had been baptized. But at night, he rewatched the recordings, repeatedly, and every single night without fail, Wiremu appeared, sometimes for 5 minutes, slipping in through the back door with a key Rakura had never seen before, moving through their house with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every creaking floorboard. Other times, for half an hour, sitting in the chair beside Kahurangi's bed where Raukura himself spent his days reading aloud from the Dominion Post, or playing old Maori music that used to make her smile. The most disturbing thing was the intimate tone between the two. They talked about the past, about secrets buried so deep that even hearing fragments made Raukura's stomach churn with dread. Wiremu knew things about Kahurangi's childhood that she'd never shared with her husband, stories about her time in the girls' home in Taranaki, about relatives whose names Raukura had never heard, about events that had shaped her in ways he was only now beginning to understand. In the fourth video, recorded on a Thursday night when Wellington's southerly winds were howling through the hills with the ferocity that made windows rattle and power lines sing, Kahurangi whispered, "She's still out there, but I can't see her. Not until he knows the whole truth." Her voice carried a weight of maternal grief that Raukura recognized from their own loss years ago, when they'd miscarried at 12 weeks and Kahurangi had spent months moving through their house like a ghost, touching baby clothes they'd bought too early, standing in doorways of rooms they'd planned to convert into nurseries. Who was she? The daughter they lost at Rotorua Hospital decades ago, when they'd driven 3 hours for a specialist appointment, only to receive the devastating news that the heartbeat had stopped. A forgotten patient from Kahurangi's time volunteering at the Women's Refuge in Porirua, where she'd spent Friday evenings teaching basic literacy to women escaping violence. A granddaughter he didn't know existed, born to some secret child whose existence had been hidden from him for reasons he couldn't fathom. The doctors never mentioned anything about this during the countless appointments, the assessments, the care planning meetings where social workers and nurses discussed Kahurangi's needs as if she weren't in the room. No one had ever suggested that her condition might be connected to anything other than the fire, that there might be psychological factors complicating her recovery. And why did Wiremu seem so emotional when listening? In one of the recordings, when Kahurangi spoke about being afraid, about promises that couldn't be broken without destroying lives, Wiremu had reached out and held her hand with the tenderness of someone who understood her pain intimately. A tear had rolled down the firefighter's weathered face, a face that bore the scars of 20 years responding to emergencies, pulling people from burning buildings and crashed cars, and he'd whispered something Raukura couldn't quite catch, something that made Kahurangi close her eyes as if absorbing comfort from words she'd been waiting desperately to hear. Raukura no longer knew who was sicker, his wife playing an elaborate charade of mental illness with Academy Award-worthy commitment, the neighbor, apparently complicit in whatever deception was unfolding in his own house, or himself, drowning in a lifetime of secrets that now exploded before his eyes like sparks from a rekindled fire. The most chilling moment came on the third night of surveillance. Kahurangi, believing herself alone in the small hours when even the Wellington traffic had died to a whisper, and the city slept under its blanket of harbor fog, began to speak to the ceiling. Her voice was different. Not the confused mumbling of a dementia patient, but the clear, purposeful tone of someone making a confession to whatever gods might be listening from the darkness above. "I should have told him from the beginning," she said to the empty air above her bed, her words carrying the weight of decades of regret. "But I was so afraid he'd leave. And then she appeared, and I just couldn't." She began to cry, real tears, not the vacant weeping he'd witnessed during the day when she seemed to mourn things she couldn't name. These were the tears of a woman carrying unbearable weight, of someone who'd made impossible choices and lived with their consequences through sleepless nights and guilty mornings. "He's such a good man," she continued, her voice breaking with the kind of pain that comes from loving someone while believing you don't deserve their love. "He deserves better than lies, but the truth would destroy everything we've built." Raukura felt his world crumbling around him like poorly mixed concrete, each revelation weakening the foundation of everything he'd thought he knew about his life, his marriage, his wife, every gentle moment of the past 2 years. Every time he'd whispered, "I love you," to what he thought was an empty shell, she had heard. She had understood, and she had chosen to remain silent, to let him believe he was caring for someone who could no longer love him back, who existed in some twilight world between life and death where connection was impossible. In the early hours of Wednesday morning, while Wellington's notorious southerly winds howled through the valleys and rattled the weatherboard houses of Lower Hutt like a banshee's wail, Kahurangi spoke a name that made Raukura nearly fall from his chair. The sound cut through the white noise of rain against windows and the distant hum of late-night traffic on the motorway, striking him with the force of a physical blow. "Marama." Her voice trembled with an emotion he couldn't identify. Part grief, part longing, part terror. She shouldn't have been born, but she was. Raukura paused the video and rewound it, his fingers fumbling with the laptop controls as if they'd forgotten how to function. The blue progress bar crawled backward through digital time, carrying him back to that moment of revelation. He pressed play again, leaning so close to the screen that his breath fogged the surface. There it was again. Marama. The name emerged from his wife's lips like a prayer and a curse combined, spoken with the reverence reserved for the sacred and the forbidden. He knew that name. It had lived in the deepest chambers of his heart for 38 years, locked away with other precious, painful memories. Marama, Moonbeam in Tereo Maori, was the name they'd chosen together during those golden months when Kahurangi's belly had swelled with promise and their modest weatherboard house had seemed to glow with anticipated joy. They'd spent hours discussing it, lying in bed with his hand on her growing bump, feeling the flutter of tiny limbs and imagining the child who would carry both their bloodlines forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. That was before the bleeding started, before the frantic midnight drive to Wellington Hospital through empty streets slick with winter rain, before the ultrasound revealed what Dr. Sarah Chen had gently called fetal demise, clinical words that couldn't capture the enormity of their loss. The way their dreams had simply stopped, or so he'd thought. With hands that trembled like autumn leaves in a gale, he made his way to the spare room wardrobe where they kept their most precious possessions. The old kauri wood box had belonged to his grandmother, carved with traditional Maori patterns that told stories of Wakapapa, genealogy stretching back through generations of his people. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper that smelled of lavender and thyme, were the remnants of their brief parenthood. Hospital bracelets from Kahurangi's admission, ultrasound images that showed the grainy outline of a baby who would never draw breath, the tiny yellow jumpsuit they'd bought at 3 months, too hopeful and too early, but unable to resist the pull of imagined tomorrows. And there, at the bottom of the box, like archaeological evidence of a civilization that had existed for only 12 weeks, was a handwritten note in Kahurangi's careful script, "Baby Marama, due March 15th, 1999. But as Raukura examined the ultrasound more carefully, something cold settled in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The medical details seemed wrong. The date matched his memory, December 1998, when they'd driven to what they thought would be a routine 20-week scan. But the hospital stamp wasn't from Wellington Regional as he remembered. It was from Masterton Public Hospital, 40 minutes north through the Rimutaka Ranges. Why would they have gone to Masterton? They'd never had any connection to that town. No reason to drive the winding mountain road when Wellington Hospital was 15 minutes from their home. And there was something else, a second ultrasound hidden beneath the first, dated 2 months later, February 1999. But that was impossible. By February, their baby was gone. Their hopes buried with the tiny casket in Taita Cemetery, where they'd placed a headstone that read simply, "Baby Menzies, too beautiful for Earth." In shock, he began connecting dots that painted a picture he couldn't accept. Kahurangi hadn't lost the baby. She'd given birth. She'd carried their child to term, somewhere in the rolling farmland around Masterton, and then, what? Hidden the birth? Given the baby away? Let him believe their child was dead while she was alive somewhere, breathing and growing and becoming a person he'd never know. The room spun around him like a child's top, and he gripped the edge of the wardrobe to steady himself. 38 years of marriage, and he'd been living with a stranger, a woman capable of deception so profound that it rewrote the fundamental narrative of their shared life. Every March 15th, when he'd placed flowers on that empty grave, she'd known their daughter was somewhere in the world, celebrating birthdays he'd never witness. In the next recording, filmed just 2 nights later, Wiramu's voice carried across the room with startling clarity. "He doesn't know, does he?" The firefighter's tone held no judgment, only a weary sadness that spoke of burdens shared across decades. Kahurangi's response cut through Raukura like a blade heated in flame. No, and he must never know. She's better off away from him. The casual cruelty of those words, the assumption that his own daughter would be better off without him, hit harder than any physical blow he'd ever endured. What kind of father did she think he was? What kind of man had she married that she'd go to such lengths to keep his child from him? But before he could sink further into the quicksand of self-doubt and rage, the present crashed into his consciousness with the jarring sound of their front doorbell. The old brass chime echoed through the house with its familiar 2-note song, the same sound that had welcomed friends and family for over 2 decades. Raukura glanced at the digital clock on his laptop. 2:47 a.m. No one visited at this hour unless something was desperately wrong. He made his way through the darkened house, past photographs that now seemed like evidence of an elaborate fiction, past furniture they'd chosen together but which she'd apparently filled with secrets he'd never suspected. The hallway stretched before him like a tunnel leading to an unknown destination, each step echoing on the wooden floors they'd refinished themselves when they'd first bought the house, and believed they understood what their future would hold. Through the frosted glass of the front door, he could see a figure hunched against the weather. Small, slight, drenched by the relentless Wellington rain that turned the streetlights into watercolor smears. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat like a fishhook finding flesh. Standing on his doorstep, soaked to the skin and shivering in the kind of thin jacket that offered no protection against New Zealand's winter fury, was a young woman who might have been Kahurangi's twin at 26. The same deep brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets, the same stubborn chin that tilted upward when facing adversity, the same graceful hands that now cradled a bundle wrapped in what looked like a donated blanket from some charitable organization. But it was when she spoke that Raukura's world tilted completely off its axis. Her voice carried the same cadence as Kahurangi's, the same slight emphasis on certain syllables that marked her as someone who'd learned English alongside Tereo Maori, someone whose tongue was comfortable with the rolling sounds of his ancestors' language. "I've come because of Kahurangi," she said, her words barely audible above the wind that whipped through the Pohutukawa trees lining their street. "She called for me. In my dreams, she's been calling for me for weeks now." The young woman shifted the bundle in her arms, and Raukura caught a glimpse of a tiny face, peaceful in sleep despite the chaos of the storm around them. "She told me it was time for you to know about us." The girl, because despite her years, something about her seemed heartbreakingly young, looked up at him with eyes that reflected decades of pain, abandonment, and a desperate hope that maybe, finally, she'd found her way home. Raukura's voice deserted him completely. He could only stare at this apparition from a past he'd never known existed, this living proof that his wife's deception ran deeper than anything he'd imagined. The young woman seemed to take his silence as permission to continue. "My name is Marama Tare," she said, and the sound of that name, their chosen name, spoken by lips that bore an uncanny resemblance to Kahurangi's, nearly brought him to his knees. I think I'm your daughter, and this," She shifted the bundle again, revealing the face of an infant who couldn't be more than a few weeks old. "This is your grandson. His name is Hayata, Morning Light, just like Mum always said she'd name her first boy." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that would consume everything he'd thought he knew about his life. Marama, Hayata, names they'd chosen together, names that were supposed to belong to children who'd died before drawing breath, now attached to living, breathing people standing on his doorstep in the middle of a Wellington winter night. As if summoned by the sound of their names spoken aloud, Kahurangi's voice drifted from the back of the house, not the confused mumbling of a dementia patient, but the clear, urgent call of a mother who sensed her child was near. "Marama, Taku Kotiro, is that you? My daughter. Is that you?" The young woman's face crumpled with an emotion too complex to name. Relief, grief, love, and fear warred across features that would have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion that painted dark circles under her eyes and hollowed her cheeks with the gauntness of someone who'd been surviving rather than living. "She knows I'm here," Marama whispered, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. Even sick, even lost in her mind, she knows her baby has come home. The name belonged to someone who shouldn't exist, yet here she stood. Marama Tare carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned early that the world was not a safe place, that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her clothes told a story of temporary shelters and charity donations. A faded Salvation Army jacket that hung loose on her slight frame, jeans that had been mended multiple times with mismatched thread, boots that had walked countless kilometers on uncertain ground. She had no documents, she explained as Raukura led her into the warmth of their lounge, just a plastic hospital bracelet that had somehow survived 26 years of displacement. The writing was faded, but Raukura could still make out baby girl Menzies and a date in March 1999, exactly when their daughter should have been born, if she'd lived, if she'd ever existed in the first place, which now seemed like the cruelest of lies. "I've been living in caravans and hostels since I was 14, Marama said, settling into the same armchair where Kahurangi used to read her evening paper, where she'd planned meals and worried about their finances, and never once mentioned having a living daughter somewhere in the world. Moving between Wanganui and Napier, following seasonal work in the orchards and vineyards, sometimes staying in emergency housing when the weather got too rough or the baby was coming." She spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone for whom uncertainty was normal, for whom home was wherever she could find shelter for the night. But when she mentioned her childhood, her voice carried an edge of something darker, abandonment that went deeper than simple poverty, a betrayal that had shaped every relationship since. "When I was 14, a blonde woman came to the foster family I was staying with in Palmerston North. She had an envelope of cash and some papers to sign. After that, no one was allowed to ask questions about where I'd come from or who my real parents were. It was like I'd been erased from the system completely." Marama's fingers traced the edges of the hospital bracelet with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. "But I kept this, even when everything else was taken away. My clothes, my toys, even the photos I had of the woman who used to visit me in secret. I kept this bracelet. It was the only proof I had that I belonged to someone. Somewhere." Raukura felt the foundations of his understanding crumble like coastal cliffs in a storm. A woman who visited in secret, blonde hair, which could describe dozens of people, but somehow felt significant in ways he couldn't grasp. Money changing hands to ensure silence. His daughter, because looking at her now, seeing Kahurangi's stubborn chin and his own dark eyes reflected back at him, there was no doubt about her parentage, had been bought and sold like property, hidden away by people who'd convinced him she was dead. Her arrival turned the house upside down in ways that went beyond the practical chaos of unexpected guests. Suddenly, their modest 3-bedroom home felt enormous and claustrophobic simultaneously. Rooms that had been shrines to a childless marriage, the spare bedroom where they'd started to paint nursery colors before stopping, the study where Kahurangi kept her books and he stored his railway memorabilia, now seemed to echo with the ghosts of lives that should have been lived within these walls. Raukura tried to maintain his composure, but something fundamental broke inside him when Marama wandered into the kitchen and paused before the refrigerator, where their old family photos were held by fading magnets. Her finger hovered over their wedding picture, him in his best suit borrowed from his brother Kahurangi, radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, both of them young and convinced they could handle whatever the future held. "You're the man from the photo," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father. She used to show me this picture when she visited, before they made her stop coming. She'd tell me stories about how you met at a church social in Otaki, how you taught her to drive in your old Ford Cortina, how you cried when you thought she was dying in the fire. The casual intimacy of these details, moments from their courtship that he'd shared with no one except Kahurangi, hit him like physical blows. All these years, while he'd been grieving a lost child, his wife had been sharing their most precious memories with a daughter he'd been told was dead. She'd painted him as a character in stories told to comfort a lonely child, while keeping that same child's existence secret from him. From the back bedroom came a sound that made them both freeze. Kahurangi was crying, not the confused, purposeless weeping that had become commonplace since the fire, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose heart was breaking and healing simultaneously. For the first time in 2 years, her tears seemed connected to something real, something that mattered more than the random synaptic misfires the doctors claimed controlled her emotional responses. Marama, Kahurangi called, her voice carrying none of the hesitation or confusion that usually marked her speech. Taku Kotiro, come here, please. My daughter, come here. The words were spoken in Te Reo Maori, the language of their people, the language Kahurangi had always planned to teach their children alongside English so they'd never forget where they came from. Marama moved toward the sound like iron filings drawn to a magnet, her steps gaining purpose as she approached the room where the woman who'd given birth to her waited. Raukura followed, feeling like an intruder in his own home, watching a reunion he'd never known was needed. When Marama appeared in the doorway, Kahurangi struggled to sit up in bed, her movement suddenly coordinated and purposeful, rather than the careful positioning required by her supposed cognitive limitations. Mother and daughter stared at each other across 26 years of separation, across decades of secrets and lies, and forced silence. You're so beautiful, Kahurangi whispered, reaching out with hands that no longer trembled with neurological damage but with the overwhelming emotion of touching her child for the first time since infancy. You look just like my mother did at your age. She would have been so proud to know you. Marama collapsed into her mother's arms like a building finally giving way to the foundation damage that had weakened it for years. The baby in her arms, Hayata, Raukura's grandson whose existence was another impossibility in a day full of them, stirred at the movement but didn't wake, as if sensing that this moment required the peace that only deep sleep could provide. I'm sorry, Kahurangi said, the words emerging between sobs that shook her entire body. I'm so sorry, my darling girl. I tried to keep you safe, but I made everything worse. I thought if he knew about you, if he knew what I'd done, what you'd done. Raukura's voice cut through the emotional reunion like a knife through silk. The question had been building pressure inside him since Marama's arrival, since the discovery of hospital records that didn't match his memories, since the realization that his entire understanding of their marriage had been built on quicksand. Both women turned to look at him, and for a moment he saw himself reflected in their eyes. A stranger in his own home, a husband and father who'd been excluded from the most important relationships in his life. Through deception so elaborate, it had required the cooperation of multiple people across decades. What did you do, Kahurangi? That was so terrible you had to fake your own brain damage to avoid telling me about it. But before she could answer, before any of them could process the magnitude of what was happening, Marama swayed on her feet like a sapling in a gale. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen and waxy. She clutched the baby tighter as her knees buckled, and Raukura lunged forward just in time to catch them both before they hit the floor. Something's wrong, he said, as blood began to seep through Marama's jeans, dark stains spreading across the denim like spilled ink. We need to call an ambulance. Kahurangi's response was immediate and devastating in its clarity. Gone was any pretense of cognitive impairment as she began issuing instructions with the authority of someone fully present and terrifyingly aware. She's hemorrhaging. Postpartum complications. Probably from lack of proper medical care. Call 111 now. Tell them we have a young mother with heavy bleeding and a newborn who needs evaluation. As Raukura fumbled for his phone, his mind reeling between relief that his wife was clearly functional and terror that his newly discovered daughter might be dying in his arms, Kahurangi continued speaking with medical precision that revealed yet another layer of deception. I'm trained in midwifery, Raukura. I studied it before we married, before the railway job became available for you and we moved to Wellington. I've been hiding that too, along with everything else. Her voice broke on the last words, but her instructions remained clear and urgent. Get towels from the bathroom, clean ones, and tell them we'll need the neonatal team for the baby. The small bedroom became a crisis center, filled with the organized chaos of emergency response. But even as Raukura worked to save his daughter's life, even as sirens wailed in the distance and paramedics raced through Wellington's empty streets toward their home, one thought echoed in his mind with devastating clarity. How many other secrets was his wife keeping? How many other lives had been hidden from him behind the convenient fiction of brain damage and memory loss? And now that the truth was finally emerging, would any of them survive its revelation intact? The hospital in Porirua was shrouded in the peculiar silence that descends on medical facilities during the early morning hours, when the boundary between night and day becomes fluid and time seems suspended in antiseptic-scented limbo. Raukura sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair outside the surgical theater, his clothes still damp from the rain and spotted with his daughter's blood, watching the digital clock above the nurse's station tick through the minutes with mechanical indifference. Marama had been between life and death when the ambulance arrived. The paramedics, a young Maori woman named Aroha, and an older Pakeha man, whose weathered hands spoke of decades spent saving lives, had worked with practiced efficiency in their lounge, transforming the space where he'd watched rugby matches and anniversary dinners into a battlefield where every second counted. The amount of blood had been staggering, soaking through towels and staining the wooden floors that Kahurangi had polished just days before, back when he'd still believed she was incapable of such simple tasks. The baby, his grandson Hayata, though the reality of that relationship still felt as foreign as speaking a language he'd never learned, had been rushed to the neonatal intensive care unit. Born too early, underweight, showing signs of the kind of medical neglect that spoke of a mother with no access to proper prenatal care. The pediatric team had whisked him away in an incubator that looked like a spaceship designed for the smallest astronauts, leaving Raukura to grapple with emotions he had no framework for processing. Kahurangi sat beside him now, fully lucid and eerily calm, as if the medical crisis had stripped away the last pretense of her elaborate deception. She'd ridden in the ambulance, providing medical history with the precision of someone who'd never lost a day of memory to brain damage, answering questions about Marama's pregnancy and birth history that revealed layers of knowledge she shouldn't have possessed if their daughter had truly been absent from their lives. "You need to see this," she said quietly, reaching into the small handbag she'd somehow remembered to grab before the ambulance departed. From its depths, she withdrew a manila envelope, creased and worn as if it had been handled countless times over many years. "The video from last night, the one where she's bleeding, and I'm screaming for help. I need you to see what happened when you thought I was too damaged to understand." Raukura's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope, unsure whether he wanted to examine its contents or throw it away unread. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained not paper but lead or guilt, or the accumulated mass of decades of deception. "This is from the camera you hid," Kahurangi continued, her voice carrying none of the confusion or hesitation that had marked her speech for 2 years. "The one behind Nana's tiki. I've known about it since the second day. I could see the little red light reflecting off the jade when the room was dark." The casual revelation hit him like a slap. She'd known he was watching her, had performed her elaborate charade while fully aware that her every movement was being recorded. The violation felt mutual now. He'd invaded her privacy, but she'd manipulated his emotions with surgical precision. Inside the envelope were printouts of medical records, birth certificates, and photographs that documented a life he'd never known existed. Official papers from Masterton Hospital showing that baby girl Menzies had been born on March 15, 1999, at 3:47 a.m., weighing 6 pounds 2 ounces. A healthy baby girl with all 10 fingers and toes, scored normally on every assessment, given to a mother who'd checked out of the hospital 12 hours later and disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of New Zealand's child welfare system. "You gave birth," he said, though the words felt inadequate to capture the enormity of what the documents revealed. "You carried her to term, delivered her safely, and then, what, just handed her over to strangers?" Kahurangi's expression crumpled like paper thrown into flames. It wasn't that simple. Nothing about any of this was simple. She pulled another photograph from the envelope, this one showing a much younger version of herself holding a newborn baby, both of them in a hospital bed that wasn't at Wellington Regional. Her face in the picture showed the exhaustion of new motherhood combined with something darker. Terror, desperation, the haunted look of someone who'd made an impossible choice. "I was sent away," she began, her voice barely audible above the hospital's ambient noise of monitors beeping and ventilation systems humming. When I started showing, when it became obvious I was pregnant, my family, they couldn't handle the shame. An unmarried Maori girl carrying a baby in 1998. It was different then, Raukura. The judgment, the gossip, the way people would cross the street rather than acknowledge our existence. She paused, gathering strength for revelations that had been locked away for over 2 decades. They sent me to a home for unwed mothers in Masterton, run by the Anglican Church, supposedly a place where girls could have their babies in secret and then make appropriate arrangements for their futures. What they didn't tell us was that those arrangements had already been made. The babies were going to families who could afford to pay for them, and we were just the vessels delivering the merchandise. The words painted a picture of institutional cruelty that made Raukura's stomach churn. His wife, barely 22 at the time, alone and frightened, had been shipped off like an inconvenience, isolated from everyone who loved her while strangers made decisions about her child's future. "But you kept her," he said, studying the photograph where Kahurangi's arms wrapped protectively around the infant. "At least initially. This picture shows you bonding with her. For 3 days," Kahurangi whispered. "They let me hold her for 3 days while they processed the paperwork. I named her Marama, even though they said it didn't matter since the adoptive family would choose their own name. I fed her, changed her, slept with her on my chest so she'd know she was loved, even if it was only for 72 hours. The image of his young wife, alone in a strange place, cherishing every moment with a baby she knew would be taken from her, brought tears to his eyes. But beneath the sympathy was a growing anger that she'd never told him any of this, that she'd let him believe their child was dead, rather than trust him with the truth. "They came for her on the 4th morning," Kahurangi continued. "A social worker with kind eyes and a clipboard full of lies about how the adoptive family was perfect, how they could give her opportunities we never could. I fought them. I screamed and begged and threatened to call the police, but I was just a frightened girl with no money and no legal representation. They took her anyway. So how did she end up in the foster system? If she was adopted by this perfect family, why was she living in caravans and moving between hostels?" Kahurangi's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Because the perfect family decided after 6 months that raising a Maori child was more challenging than they'd anticipated. They returned her to the system like a defective appliance, and by then the paperwork had been altered to hide her connection to us. She became just another displaced kid in an overburdened system, and I spent years trying to find her through legal channels that led nowhere." The puzzle pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. His wife hadn't abandoned their daughter. She'd been systematically separated from her by institutions that treated vulnerable women as little more than breeding stock for wealthy couples who wanted babies, but not the complicated realities of raising children who didn't match their expectations. "I found her again when she was 12, Kahurangi said, producing another photograph showing Marama as a child. Thin, serious, standing outside what looked like a state housing complex, in clothes that were clean but obviously secondhand. She was living with a foster family in Wanganui, who took in kids for the money and provided minimal care. I started visiting her in secret, bringing her things she needed, trying to be part of her life without disrupting the placement. For 14 years? You maintained contact with our daughter for 14 years without telling me she existed?" The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. While he'd been placing flowers on an empty grave every March, while he'd been grieving for a child who'd never had a chance at life, Kahurangi had been building a relationship with that same child behind his back. "I wanted to tell you," she said, reaching for his hand with fingers that no longer trembled with neurological damage, but with the desperation of someone trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. 1,000 times I started to say the words, but I was terrified you'd try to bring her home, and I knew what that would mean. What would it have meant? Having our daughter in our lives? Being a family? Kahurangi's eyes filled with tears that spoke of fears he couldn't fathom. It would have meant exposing the truth about how she was conceived, about why my family sent me away, about why I was so desperate to hide her existence that I was willing to let you believe she was dead. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She wasn't your biological daughter, Raukura. The father was someone else, someone whose identity would have destroyed everything we'd built together." The revelation hit him like a physical blow, restructuring everything he thought he understood about their relationship, their marriage, their life together. Marama, the daughter he'd been bonding with, The young woman whose presence had filled empty spaces in his heart he hadn't known existed wasn't biologically his, but as the shock faded, replaced by something he couldn't name, he realized that the genetic connection mattered less than he'd expected. "Who?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Before Koharangi could respond, a doctor in green scrubs emerged from the surgical ward, her expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learned to deliver news that could shatter or heal families with equal efficiency. "Mr. and Mrs. Menzies, I need to speak with you about your daughter's condition." When Marama awakened in the sterile confines of Porirua Hospital's maternity ward, her face was pale as fresh snow against the institutional white pillows, and her eyes held the unfocused quality of someone swimming up from the depths of pharmaceutical sleep. The surgery had been more extensive than the doctors initially anticipated. Internal bleeding from retained placental fragments, complications that spoke of a birth attended by desperation rather than medical expertise, delivered perhaps in a caravan or emergency shelter where privacy mattered more than proper care. She tried to sit up when she saw Koharangi beside her bed, but the movement sent visible waves of pain across her features like ripples spreading through still water. Her mother? The word still felt foreign to Raukura. Laden with implications he was struggling to process, reached out immediately to steady her, speaking in the gentle tones reserved for the wounded and vulnerable. "Don't move, darling," Koharangi said, her voice carrying none of the confusion or hesitation that had marked her speech for 2 years. "There's still healing to be done. Still so much to repair." The words carried double meaning, referring as much to the emotional wounds that had festered for decades as to the physical trauma that had nearly claimed Marama's life in their lounge just hours earlier. Raukura observed from his position near the window, still uncertain of his place in this reunion he'd never known was needed. The view looked out over Porirua Harbor, where early morning light was beginning to paint the water in shades of gold and silver, and commercial fishing boats were heading out for their daily harvest. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made Wellington's surrounding areas feel like separate worlds, far removed from the urban intensity of the capital city proper. But the tranquility outside contrasted sharply with the emotional maelstrom inside the small hospital room, where 3 people were trying to navigate relationships that had been fractured by decades of secrets, lies, and institutional cruelty. The baby, Hayata, had been in the neonatal intensive care unit overnight, monitored by specialists who were cautiously optimistic about his chances despite his premature arrival and the circumstances of his birth. Then, as if summoned by some maternal instinct that transcended medical protocols, the sound of an infant's cry echoed down the corridor. Not the general background noise of a hospital's youngest patients, but a specific, urgent call that made Marama's head turn toward the doorway with the intensity of a compass needle finding magnetic north. A nurse appeared moments later, wheeling a clear plastic bassinet that contained what looked like the smallest, most perfect human being Raukura had ever seen. The baby was wrapped in hospital blankets that dwarfed his tiny frame, but his eyes were alert and searching, as if he was already trying to make sense of the world he'd entered under such dramatic circumstances. "Someone's been asking for his mum," the nurse said with the kind of professional cheerfulness that masked the serious medical concerns surrounding premature births. "His vitals are stable, and he's showing good reflexes. The pediatrician will want to discuss ongoing care, but for now, skin-to-skin contact will be beneficial for both of you." Marama struggled to sit up properly, her movement still hampered by surgical pain and the after-effects of anesthesia, but her arms reached for the baby with the instinctive certainty of maternal love. When the nurse placed Hayata against her chest, the transformation was immediate and profound. The young woman who'd appeared on their doorstep looking like a refugee from her own life suddenly radiated a strength that had nothing to do with physical health and everything to do with the fierce protectiveness that motherhood awakens. "How should we register him?" the nurse asked, consulting a clipboard that contained forms requiring official decisions about names, next of kin, and all the bureaucratic details that transform the miracle of birth into administrative data. "We'll need a surname for the birth certificate and emergency contact information." Marama looked uncertain for the first time since awakening, her eyes moving between Koharangi and Raukura, as if seeking permission for something she wasn't sure she had the right to claim. The question of names carried weight beyond simple identification. It was about belonging, about family connections that had been severed and might possibly be rebuilt. Before anyone could respond, Koharangi spoke with the quiet authority of someone making a decision that had been decades in the contemplation. "His name is Hayata Menzies," she said, the surname emerging like a declaration of war against all the forces that had tried to keep their family apart. "And his emergency contacts are his grandparents, Kahurangi and Raukura Menzies of Lower Hutt." Raukura felt his breath catch in his throat. Hayata. It was the name they'd chosen together 39 years earlier, when they'd lost their first pregnancy and thought they'd never have another chance to use the beautiful Maori word that meant first light of dawn. The name had lived in the secret chambers of his heart alongside all the other dreams that had died with that early miscarriage, stored away like christening gowns that would never be worn and lullabies that would never be sung. But now, watching his wife, his apparently never cognitively impaired wife, claim their grandson with a name that bridged their shared past and uncertain future, he felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of grief that had calcified around his heart like scar tissue, a possibility that the family he'd mourned might still be within reach, albeit in forms he'd never imagined. "Hayata," he repeated, testing the syllables on his tongue like a prayer in a language he'd almost forgotten how to speak. The baby seemed to respond to the sound, tiny fingers opening and closing as if grasping for something just beyond reach. First light, new beginnings. Marama's eyes filled with tears that spoke of emotions too complex for simple categorization. "She told me about that name," she said, her voice barely audible above the ambient hospital sounds of monitors beeping and ventilation systems humming. "When she used to visit me, before they made her stop, she'd say that someday, when the family was whole again, there'd be a baby boy named Hayata who'd bring light to all the dark places." The revelation that Kahurangi had been planning this reunion, that she'd been preparing their daughter for eventual integration into a family that officially didn't include her, added another layer to the already overwhelming complexity of their situation. How long had his wife been orchestrating this moment? How many other details of their life together had been carefully managed to support an elaborate fiction that was only now beginning to unravel? That night, after the medical staff had completed their assessments and declared both mother and baby stable enough for extended family visits, Raukura found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time since Marama's dramatic arrival. The hospital corridors at midnight were almost peaceful, populated only by duty nurses making their rounds and the occasional family member maintaining vigils beside the beds of loved ones caught between recovery and loss. He made his way to the hospital chapel, a small interfaith space designed to accommodate the spiritual needs of people from all backgrounds. The room was simple, furnished with wooden pews that faced a wall containing symbols from various religious traditions: a cross, a Star of David, an Islamic crescent, a Buddhist wheel, and in the center, a carved jade tiki that reminded him of the sculpture behind which he'd hidden his surveillance camera. Sitting in the front pew, surrounded by the quiet that only sacred spaces seemed to generate, Raukura tried to process the fundamental changes that had reshaped his understanding of everything he'd thought he knew about his life. His wife wasn't brain damaged. His daughter wasn't dead. His grandson bore the name they'd chosen for a child who'd never had the chance to carry it. But beneath the relief and wonder was a current of something darker, the knowledge that these revelations had come at enormous cost. Marama had grown up in foster care, moving between placements that provided shelter but not love, aging out of the system at 18 with no family connections and no support network beyond what she could create for herself. She'd survived by developing the kind of self-reliance that came from learning early that the adults responsible for her care couldn't be trusted to put her needs first. And Kahurangi, his wife, his partner, the woman he'd thought he knew better than anyone else in the world, had been carrying the weight of these secrets for decades, letting them eat away at her mental health until she'd chosen to retreat into a fictional illness rather than face the possibility of losing him. The fire 2 years earlier hadn't caused brain damage. It had been a breaking point, a moment when the accumulated stress of maintaining such an elaborate deception had finally overwhelmed her ability to continue. As he sat in the chapel's peaceful silence, Raukura found himself facing questions that had no easy answers. Could he forgive a deception so profound that it had shaped every major decision of their marriage? Could he build a relationship with a daughter and grandson whose existence challenged everything he'd believed about family, genetics, and belonging? And perhaps most importantly, could he find a way to love them not despite their complicated history, but because of their survival against odds that had been deliberately stacked against them? The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity. Love wasn't a choice based on genetic connections or official documentation. It wasn't something that required perfect honesty or uncomplicated histories. It was the decision to show up, to stay present, to choose connection over abandonment, regardless of how messy and difficult the circumstances might be. Tomorrow he would return to that hospital room where his wife was dropping her 2-year charade, and his daughter was learning to trust that family might mean something different from everything she'd experienced. He would hold his grandson and teach him the Maori words for grandfather, koro, and explain how names could carry the hopes of people who'd loved you before you were born. Tonight, though, he simply sat in the chapel's quiet embrace and felt his heart breaking open to accommodate forms of love he'd never known were possible. The morning after brought Wellington's familiar combination of brilliant sunshine and cutting wind, the kind of weather that made the capital city feel simultaneously welcoming and hostile, depending on which direction you were facing. Raukura had spent the night in the hospital's family accommodation, a cramped room with institutional furniture and windows that looked out over the car park, where early shift workers were arriving for another day of healing and heartbreak. But sleep had been elusive, haunted by questions that demanded answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. The revelation that Marama wasn't biologically his daughter had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of their family dynamic, but it hadn't diminished the protective instincts that had emerged the moment she'd appeared on their doorstep. If anything, knowing that she'd survived 26 years without a father figure made him more determined to fill that role now. Genetics be damned. However, there was still the matter of Wiremu Fahey, the neighbor whose late-night visits to Kahurangi had triggered this entire revelation. The firefighter who'd been present at every crucial moment, who'd known about Marama's existence while Raukura remained ignorant, who seemed to understand family secrets that predated their marriage. The man who'd saved Kahurangi's life during the fire, but might also hold the key to understanding why she'd felt the need to stage that fire in the first place. Before returning to the hospital, Raukura made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He drove through Lower Hutt's morning traffic, past the railway yards where he'd worked for 23 years before redundancy forced him into early retirement, past the community center where he and Kahurangi had attended their first dance together in 1986, past all the landmarks of a life that now felt like it had been lived by someone else. Wiremu's house sat on a quarter-acre section that backed up to the bush-covered hills surrounding the Hutt Valley. It was a modest weatherboard cottage, painted in the kind of muted greens and browns that helped buildings blend into New Zealand's landscape, surrounded by vegetable gardens that spoke of someone who valued self-sufficiency and connection to the land. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Raukura could hear the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood somewhere behind the house. He found Wiremu in the backyard, working through a pile of macrocarpa logs with the methodical efficiency of someone for whom physical labor was both necessity and meditation. The firefighter didn't seem surprised to see him, barely pausing in his work as Raukura approached across grass still wet with dew that would burn off once the sun gained strength. Raukura, Wiremu acknowledged with a nod, sinking the axe blade into the chopping block and straightening to face his unexpected visitor. "I figured you'd be along eventually. How's the girl? And the baby?" The casual way he asked about Marama and Hayata, as if their well-being was something he'd been concerned about for years rather than learning of their existence just hours earlier, confirmed what Raukura had already suspected. Wiremu's involvement in their family drama went deeper than simple neighborly concern. "They're stable," Raukura replied, studying the other man's face for clues about motivations and connections he was only beginning to understand. "Marama will need time to recover from the surgery, but the doctors are optimistic. Hayata is small but healthy. They'll both be in hospital for at least another week." Wiremu nodded, relief evident in the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good. She's been through enough already. They both have." He gestured toward a pair of wooden chairs positioned to catch the morning sun. "I suppose you have questions?" That was an understatement of staggering proportions. Raukura had questions about everything, about Marama's father, about Kahurangi's deception, about Wiremu's role in maintaining secrets that had shaped decades of his life without his knowledge. But he started with the most immediate concern. "You've been visiting my wife at night for months. You have a key to our house. You know about our daughter's existence when I was told she died as an infant. I need to understand who you are in this story, Wiremu, because right now I don't know if you're part of the solution or part of the problem." Wiremu was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping as if he was physically grappling with decisions about how much truth to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying burdens that weren't entirely his own. "I knew Kahurangi before you did," he said, the words emerging like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything around them. "We met at the unwed mother's home in Masterton in 1998. I wasn't there as a father. I was there as a volunteer with the fire service, doing safety inspections on buildings that housed vulnerable populations." The timeline clicked into place with sickening clarity. Wiremu had been there during Kahurangi's pregnancy, had witnessed the institutional machinery that separated mothers from their children, had seen firsthand the trauma that would mark his wife for decades to come. "She was different from the other girls," Wiremu continued, his gaze fixed on the hills where morning mist was beginning to dissipate under increasing sunlight. "Older, more educated, but also more desperate. Most of the others seemed resigned to giving up their babies, but Kahurangi, she was planning something, preparing for a fight she knew she couldn't win but was determined to have anyway." "You helped her?" The question carried implications that made Raukura's stomach clench with possibilities he didn't want to consider. "Not the way you're thinking," Wiremu said, apparently reading the suspicion in his voice. "I never touched her, never had any kind of romantic relationship with her. But I saw what that place was doing to vulnerable women, how it was treating them like livestock in a breeding program designed to provide babies for wealthy couples who couldn't or wouldn't conceive naturally." He paused, gathering strength for revelations that had clearly been weighing on him for decades. "My sister Emma had been through the same system 5 years earlier. Different facility, same outcome. They took her baby, told her it was for the best, and she never recovered from the loss. She died by suicide 2 years later, and I've spent every day since then wondering if I could have done something to help her fight back." The mention of his sister's death cast Wiremu's subsequent actions in a different light. His involvement with Kahurangi wasn't romantic or predatory. It was the response of someone who'd failed to save one vulnerable woman and was determined not to fail another. "So when I saw Kahurangi planning her escape with baby Marama, I helped, not by providing the plan but by looking the other way when she implemented it, by failing to report the security breach that allowed her to leave the facility with her daughter, by creating enough confusion in the administrative records that it took them 3 days to realize she was gone." Raukura felt his understanding of their family history reshaping itself yet again. Kahurangi hadn't simply been a victim of institutional cruelty. She'd been a fighter who'd found allies in unexpected places, someone who'd risked everything to maintain connection with their daughter, even when official channels failed her. "But she couldn't keep Marama," he said, trying to reconcile this image of his wife as a determined rebel with the reality that their daughter had still ended up in foster care. "No," Wiremu agreed, sadness evident in his voice. "She was just 22 with no money, no support system, and a legal establishment that was actively working against her. After 3 weeks of hiding in hostels and emergency shelters, she made the hardest decision of her life. She contacted a Maori social worker in Wanganui who promised to place Marama with a Wanao family who would respect her cultural heritage and maintain some connection to her birth mother. But that's not what happened. No, the social worker meant well, but the system was bigger than any one person's good intentions. Marama ended up in a series of placements that were adequate at best, neglectful at worst, and Kahurangi spent the next 14 years tracking her through an underfunded, overburdened welfare system that treated displaced children as administrative inconveniences rather than human beings with needs and rights. The scope of his wife's deception was becoming clearer, but so was the desperation that had motivated it. She hadn't hidden their daughter's existence out of malice or selfishness. She'd been protecting a relationship that existed outside legal recognition, maintaining connection through unofficial channels that required absolute secrecy to survive. "When did you reconnect with her?" Raukura asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 2 years ago, after the fire." Wiremu's expression grew somber. "She called me from the hospital, barely conscious, asking me to check on Marama because she was afraid she might not survive her injuries. That's when I learned she'd been visiting the girl in secret for over a decade, that she'd been maintaining a relationship with our daughter that no one else knew about." The word "our" hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that was still burning. Raukura felt his chest tighten with the implications of that possessive pronoun, with the suggestion that Wiremu's connection to their family was more complex than simple friendship or shared history. "Our daughter?" he repeated, his voice carefully controlled despite the storm of emotions building behind his words. Wiremu met his gaze directly, and in his eyes, Raukura saw the truth he'd been dreading since Kahurangi's revelation about Marama's biological father. The firefighter's weathered face carried traces of features that Raukura had noticed in his daughter without understanding their significance: the shape of her nose, the set of her jaw, the way she held her head when listening intently. "Yes," Wiramu said quietly. "Marama is my biological daughter. But Raukura, you need to understand. Kahurangi and I were never lovers. What happened between us was a single night of mutual comfort between two broken people who were grieving losses they couldn't share with anyone else. It meant nothing beyond that moment, and it's haunted both of us ever since." The revelation should have felt like a betrayal, but instead Raukura found himself feeling something closer to relief. The knowledge that his wife had been unfaithful once under extraordinary circumstances was somehow easier to process than the possibility that their entire marriage had been built on lies. This was a specific failure, a moment of human weakness, rather than a fundamental corruption of everything they'd built together. "Does she know?" he asked. "Marama, does she know you're her father?" "We told her yesterday while you were at the hospital," Wiramu admitted. "She has a right to know her medical history, her genetic heritage, but she also made it clear that biology doesn't automatically create family bonds. The man who raises you, who chooses to love you, who shows up when you need him, that's who earns the title of father." As if summoned by the weight of their conversation, Raukura's phone buzzed with a text message from Kahurangi. "Marama is asking for you. Can you come back to the hospital? She wants to talk about what happens next." Standing in Wiramu's backyard, surrounded by the debris of truth that had finally been allowed to surface, Raukura realized that the question of paternity was less important than the question of presence. Marama needed a father, Hayata needed a grandfather, and Kahurangi needed a husband who could forgive the past in service of building a future none of them had imagined possible. "I should go," he said, rising from the chair that had somehow become a confessional. "But Wiramu, thank you for helping her all those years ago, for protecting them when I didn't even know they needed protection, for being there when I couldn't be." The firefighter nodded, understanding passing between them like heat from a shared flame. "Family isn't always about blood, Raukura. Sometimes it's about choosing to love people who need loving and letting them love you back when you need it most." As Raukura drove back toward the hospital, past the landmarks of a life that was being rewritten with each revelation, he found himself thinking about bridges, how they could be burned by circumstance and betrayal, but also how they could be rebuilt by people willing to do the hard work of forgiveness and trust. The family waiting for him at Porirua Hospital wasn't the one he'd expected to have, but it might be the one he was meant to love. The letter had been written on the day of the fire, though Raukura was only seeing it now 2 years later, in the sterile, fluorescent lighting of Porirua Hospital's family consultation room. Kahurangi's handwriting was shakier than usual, reflecting the emotional state that had prompted her to light that candle with such devastating consequences, but every word was legible, every sentence crafted with the precision of someone who knew this might be her only chance to explain the unexplainable. "I need you to read this before we go any further," Kahurangi said, extending the envelope with hands that no longer trembled with neurological damage but with the weight of secrets finally being released. "It's everything I couldn't say for 26 years. Everything I was too afraid to tell you, too ashamed to admit, too terrified to risk." Marama sat in the chair beside her mother's hospital bed, Hayata sleeping peacefully in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythm of new life that had somehow found its way into their complicated family constellation. She looked stronger today, though still pale from the surgery and the blood loss that had nearly claimed her life in their lounge just days earlier. But there was something different in her expression, a settling, as if she was finally allowing herself to believe that this reunion might be permanent rather than another temporary connection destined to be severed by forces beyond her control. The letter was dated July 15, 2022, the night their lives had changed forever, though Raukura was only now understanding how profoundly. He unfolded the pages carefully, aware that he was handling not just paper and ink but the distilled essence of his wife's grief, guilt, and desperate hope for redemption. "My dearest Raukura," it began, and even those 3 words carried more emotional weight than entire conversations they'd shared during her supposed cognitive decline. "If you are reading this, it means I have either found the courage to give it to you, or I am gone, and you have discovered it among my things. Either way, you deserve to know the truth about the fire, about Marama, about the choices I made that have shaped our entire marriage without your knowledge. The letter went on to detail revelations that surpassed even his darkest suspicions about the complexity of their situation. The candle that had caused the fire hadn't been an accident, as everyone believed, but it hadn't been a suicide attempt either. It had been something far more desperate and complicated. A desperate woman's attempt to destroy evidence that could have exposed not just her own secrets, but a network of corruption that had been operating within New Zealand's child welfare system for decades. I discovered that the Anglican facility in Masterton, where I gave birth to Marama, was part of a larger operation, Kahurangi had written, her handwriting becoming more urgent as the revelations built upon each other. They weren't just facilitating adoptions. They were selling babies to wealthy families overseas, falsifying death certificates for children who were very much alive, and systematically destroying the records that might allow birth mothers to reconnect with their children later. The scope of the institutional cruelty described in the letter made Raukura's stomach clench with nausea. His wife hadn't just been the victim of a single traumatic separation. She'd been caught up in what amounted to organized child trafficking, disguised as charitable work by people who claimed to be serving God and community. When Marama aged out of the foster system, she began searching for information about her birth family. The letter continued. Her inquiries triggered some kind of alarm within the network, and suddenly people were asking questions about irregularities in her adoption records. I realized that if the truth came out about how she'd been born, if investigators started looking into the Masterton facility, they would discover evidence of crimes that could send dozens of people to prison. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Buried in the middle pages of Kahurangi's confession, like a bomb designed to explode long after the initial shock had worn off. The blonde woman who had paid to ensure Marama's silence when she was 14 wasn't a random operative of some criminal network. She was Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the prominent Auckland socialite who had adopted Marama as an infant and returned her to the system when the realities of raising a Maori child proved more challenging than anticipated. Dr. Thornfield had become wealthy through her involvement in facilitating international adoptions, Kahurangi wrote. When Marama started asking questions that could expose the entire operation, Thornfield paid to have her records sealed and her connections to the facility erased. But she also threatened something worse. If Marama continued her search, if she ever tried to contact her birth family, Thornfield would ensure that terrible things happened to the people she loved. The fire, Raukura now understood, had been Kahurangi's attempt to destroy correspondence between herself and Dr. Thornfield. Documents that detailed not just the threats against their family, but evidence of the larger criminal conspiracy. She'd been burning letters, photographs, and legal documents that could have brought down the network, but would also have made their family a target for people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. I never intended for the fire to spread, the letter explained. I thought I could burn the documents safely in the bathroom sink, but the papers were more numerous than I'd anticipated, and the flames got away from me. When I realized I was trapped, when the smoke started filling my lungs, I thought about you finding my body and never knowing why I'd chosen to die, surrounded by the evidence of my deception. The irony was crushing in its completeness. Kahurangi's attempt to protect their family by destroying dangerous evidence had nearly killed her, and had given her the perfect cover story for the cognitive decline she'd been using to avoid further questions. The brain damage that wasn't real had become the shield behind which she could hide from people who might still wish their family harm. The dementia was my choice, she wrote, the words stark and uncompromising on the page. I realized that if I appeared to have lost my memory, if I seemed incapable of coherent thought or communication, then Dr. Thornfield and her associates would leave us alone. A brain-damaged woman couldn't pose a threat to their operation, couldn't provide evidence to investigators, couldn't remember enough details to be dangerous. For 2 years, while Raukura had been grieving the loss of his wife's mind, Kahurangi had been maintaining an elaborate performance designed to keep their family safe from enemies he'd never known existed. Every moment of apparent confusion, every episode of vacant staring, every occasion when she'd failed to recognize him or remember basic facts about their life together, all of it had been acting, carried out with Academy Award-worthy commitment to protect people she loved from consequences they couldn't imagine. But the performance had been destroying her from the inside, eating away at her mental health with the corrosive effects of isolation and deception. I thought I could maintain the charade indefinitely, she wrote, but watching you care for me as if I were a child, seeing you grieve for the woman you thought I'd been, Knowing that I was causing you pain to prevent different, but potentially worse pain, it was killing me by degrees. The decision to install the hidden camera had been the catalyst that forced the truth to surface. Kahurangi had known about the surveillance from the beginning, had used it as an opportunity to communicate with Wiremu about their daughter's situation while maintaining her cover story during daylight hours. But she'd also used it to test whether Raukura was ready to handle the magnitude of what she'd been hiding. I left clues in those recordings, she admitted in the letter, references to her, mentions of promises and secrets, conversations with Wiremu that I knew you would eventually overhear. I was hoping you would piece together enough of the truth to ask the right questions, so I could finally stop pretending to be someone I wasn't. As Raukura finished reading the letter, he felt his understanding of their marriage reshaping itself yet again. His wife wasn't the woman he'd thought he'd married, but she also wasn't the stranger her deceptions had initially made her seem. She was someone who'd made impossible choices under extraordinary pressure, who'd sacrificed her own mental health and their relationship's honesty to protect family members he hadn't even known existed. There's something else, Marama said quietly, shifting Hayata to a more comfortable position as she prepared to add her own revelations to the evening's emotional archaeology. About Dr. Thornfield, about why she really wanted me to stay hidden. She reached into the bag beside her chair and withdrew a manila folder that looked official, stamped with the letterhead of a legal firm in Auckland. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago, when Hayata was born, and I realized I needed to know my family's medical history. What he found, it's bigger than what Mum wrote in that letter. The documents inside the folder painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond a single adoption facility. Dr. Thornfield had been at the center of an international network that had been operating for over 30 years, facilitating the illegal transfer of indigenous children from New Zealand, Australia, and Canada to wealthy families in Europe and North America. The financial records showed millions of dollars in transactions disguised as charitable donations, administrative fees, and medical expenses. She's dying, Marama continued, her voice carrying a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Terminal cancer, maybe 6 months left. But before she dies, she wants to make amends. She's been cooperating with an international investigation, providing evidence that's going to bring down the entire network. The final twist in their family story was both redemption and revenge, justice served by time and conscience rather than the legal system that had failed so many vulnerable families. Dr. Thornfield's deathbed conversion wouldn't undo the damage she'd caused, wouldn't restore the years that Marama had spent in foster care, or give Raukura back the time he'd lost with his daughter, but it would ensure that no other families suffered the same systematic separation and exploitation. 3 weeks later, on a brilliant Wellington morning when the harbor sparkled like scattered diamonds and the Pohutukawa trees were beginning to show their summer crimson, they gathered in the small Methodist church in Nainai, where Raukura's grandmother had been baptized over a century earlier. The christening of Hayata Menzies brought together the fragments of their reconstructed family in a ceremony that celebrated not just new life, but the possibility of healing relationships that had been broken by forces beyond any individual's control. Wiremu stood beside them as they made promises about raising the child in love and truth, his presence a reminder that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that responsibility and affection mattered more than genetics in determining who belonged to whom. Marama wore a dress that Kahurangi had sewn by hand during her recovery, yellow cotton printed with traditional Maori patterns that connected the baby to his cultural heritage while celebrating the new beginnings that had brought them all together. When the minister asked who would be responsible for guiding Hayata's spiritual and emotional development, there was no hesitation in Raukura's response. "We are," he said, gesturing to include not just himself and Kahurangi, but Marama and Wiremu as well. "All of us. We are his wānau, his family in every sense that matters." But even as they celebrated the expansion of their family circle, even as they made plans for the future that included supervised visits from social workers and medical follow-ups for both Marama and Hayata, there was an undercurrent of awareness that their time together might be limited in ways they were only beginning to understand. Kahurangi's health had been deteriorating since the truth emerged, as if maintaining the elaborate fiction of dementia had been the only thing keeping her functional. Without the protective barrier of pretended confusion, she was forced to confront the full weight of everything she'd endured and everything she'd put her family through. The stress manifested in physical symptoms that no amount of medical intervention seemed able to address. 3 weeks after Hayata's christening, On a quiet Tuesday morning when autumn mist clung to the Hutt Valley hills like gossamer, Kahurangi suffered what the doctors diplomatically called a significant cardiac event. The heart attack was massive, swift, and ultimately merciful in its efficiency. She died in her sleep at Wellington Hospital, surrounded by the family she'd fought so hard to protect and reunite. Her final words, whispered to Raukura during a brief moment of consciousness before the end, were characteristically selfless. "Take care of our babies. All of them. Promise me they'll know they're loved." At her tangi, held in the same church where they'd celebrated Hayata's baptism just weeks earlier, hundreds of people came to pay their respects to a woman whose public life had seemed unremarkable, but whose private sacrifices had protected countless vulnerable families. Representatives from the International Investigation into the Adoption Network spoke about her courage in providing evidence that would prevent future crimes. Social workers who'd helped place Maori children with loving families credited her advocacy work with improving conditions for displaced Indigenous children throughout New Zealand. But it was Marama who delivered the most powerful tribute, standing at the lectern with Hayata sleeping peacefully in her arms, speaking about a mother's love that had transcended every obstacle placed in its path. "She taught me that family isn't about perfection," Marama said, her voice carrying across the packed church with the strength that came from finally understanding her place in the world. "It's about showing up when people need you, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted for yourself." Raukura, sitting in the front pew beside Wiramu and the extended wanao that had emerged from decades of enforced separation, felt the truth of those words settling into his bones like warmth from a fire. The family he'd ended up with wasn't the one he'd planned or expected, but it was the one that needed him most. Marama needed a father who could help her navigate the complexities of raising a child while healing from her own traumatic childhood. Hayata needed a grandfather who could teach him about his heritage and help him understand that belonging wasn't about genetics, but about choice and commitment. And Wiramu needed a brother who understood that redemption was possible even for people who'd made terrible mistakes. That family could be rebuilt even after it had been shattered by forces that seemed insurmountable. 6 months later, in the small weatherboard house in Lower Hutt where secrets had finally given way to truth, Raukura sat in his favorite chair watching Marama teach Hayata to say Koro, grandfather, in Te Reo Maori. The baby was thriving under the care of people who'd chosen to love him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He would grow up knowing his complicated history, understanding that his family had been forged in trauma but strengthened by the decision to prioritize love over convenience, truth over comfort. On the mantelpiece, beside photographs from Hayata's christening and Kahurangi's tangi, sat a small piece of paper with Kahurangi's final message, written in her careful handwriting just days before her death. "The truth hurts, but only it heals." Those words had become their family motto, a reminder that honesty was painful but necessary, that secrets might provide temporary protection, but ultimately caused more damage than the truths they were meant to hide. In choosing transparency over deception, in deciding to trust each other with their flaws and failures, they'd created something more resilient than the fictional perfect family that existed only in carefully curated photographs and social media posts. As Hayata's laughter filled the house where his grandmother had once pretended to forget her own name to protect the people she loved most, Raukura understood that some stories didn't have neat endings. Some families weren't built on foundation of shared genetics and uncomplicated histories, but the love that grew from conscious choice, from the decision to stay present even when it was difficult, from the commitment to show up for people who needed showing up for, that love was perhaps more valuable than anything that came easily or without cost. The hidden camera behind the tiki sculpture was long gone, replaced by open communication and the radical trust that came from people who'd survived the worst and decided to build something better from the wreckage. In the end, the truth hadn't destroyed their family. It had simply revealed that their family was larger, more complicated, and more resilient than any of them had ever imagined possible. What if the person you love most kept a secret that would change everything you believed to be true? Would you have the courage to forgive, or would you walk away forever? Sometimes the greatest acts of love are born from silence, from mistakes, from pain, and it's in the moment when everything seems to crumble that truth reveals itself, not to destroy but to rebuild what should never have been broken. How many stories lie hidden within your own family, waiting only for courage to come to light? If you were in Raukura's place, Would you have had the strength to hear the truth? Would you have embraced your lost daughter? Would you have held that baby in your arms and started again? Because in the end, life is this. Not what we plan, but what we choose to do with the pieces that remain after the fall. If this story touched your heart in any way, give it a thumbs up, share it with someone you love, and follow our channel so you don't miss the next stories that, like this one, have the power to move and transform. Sometimes, all someone needs is to hear a story like this, to find the strength to begin again. Which city are you watching from? Let us know in the comments.